Hey, it's Bill Gross, and I thought I would create this short video instructions on how to write a purchase offer, and more importantly, an overview of the new purchase offer that's being launched here any day. We suspect Wednesday this week, December 15th or 14th, but any day we expect the new RPA, the California Association of Realtor form for residential purchase agreement, to be launched. And I thought I would take a few minutes to overview the changes in the forms. Very exciting, good stuff, as well as just to do an overview on, in general, when you're writing offers, what you want to do. So, I recently watched one of my colleagues, a high producing colleague, Kurt Whistle from San Diego, EXP. And he gave a talk about how to make have an excellent buyer presentation. It was fantastic. It reminded me, because I tend to be a listing agent, that if we're going to do something, we got to do it properly. You have to do things the right way for professionals. And so I know for me, I take my contracts very seriously. I want the forms to reflect me and my client in the best possible light. And when I tell new agents all the time, because they tend to kind of poo-poo the contract, thinking, well, that's just the compliance stuff. I have to get a deal. And I tell them that for my clients, I'm a ninja real estate agent. I'm a bodyguard to my buyer as he buys property, or I'm a bodyguard to my seller as they sell property. And the contracts are my swords and my knives and my star weapons. And by using those forms properly, I have an advantage over the competition who may not. And so I understand that the contract is part of a process to represent your client to get the outcome that they want, either the most dollars if they're the seller in the best terms, or the lowest price in the best terms if they're the buyer. And the contract is one of the key parts of that. Now, a couple of things to overview. Number one, it's part of a process. It has to blend into everything else. Number two, when I write an offer, I always go to the MLS and review in detail the MLS agent full detail report and review the private remarks, because oftentimes agents will have specific instructions there on don't submit offers until this date or after this date, or what email to send it to, or some form they want included, or their lender. You have to read that instruction. Also, I attach a copy of that report with my offer. What I'm saying to the listing agent is, I saw your MLS instructions and I read them, and in fact, they're attached here. It also documents the commission, because once the commission's set, the listing agent can't change it, and if they do, it won't affect your contract as long as your offer is being negotiated or it gets accepted. So really important to print out the MLS agent full detail with all the private remarks and read them in detail with your offers. Also, how do you create the forms? Now, there was a time we had a choice between SkySlope and zip forms. That went away a few years ago, and we could only access forms in zip forms. But recently, a few months ago, we had the ability to add forms into SkySlope. I do like their integration, and I use both of them, and I recommend the SkySlope integration. But either way, you need to learn the software so you can prepare your forms and have them look excellent. I like SkySlope because it has a better implementation for trusts and probate and non-human being owners of property, if you will, corporations, LLCs, and such. I like the way they do that. I find the e-signing much easier in SkySlope for customers than in the zip forms. But I find that their contact information is kludgy, meaning in zip forms, it keeps all my past clients easy to redo, whereas in zip forms, in SkySlope, I have to re-input every transaction, the contacts. Even though it saves them somewhere, it doesn't seem to be properly implemented yet. But I do like the SkySlope overall implementation. They also added in the disclosure form. So now that we have the forms, what do we do and how do we do it in a way that's effective for our clients? So what I want to do to you today is share my screen, and let's see here. There we go. So this is the new RPA form, California Association of Realtor Residential Purchase Agreement, and it's called Form RPA, and December 21st, not yet released. So that's why it has the word draft written across of it. It may have some minor changes at the end. I don't think we will. So obviously in our software, we put the date prepared, the buyer's name, the property address. You always want to import the address. Both SkySlope and zip forms have an option where you search the property and bring it in. That brings in the address as it's in the MLS, or bring in the APN number. That way you don't have a typo or problem like that. Very important, I think, to import the property, and that brings in all the other information. Disclosures. It's crazy how sloppy agents are. And I think also you miss the opportunity to kind of flatter the agent that you work with, and also show them that you're doing your homework, because You want their brokerage name in there. You want their license in there and properly. Nothing's worse than when I get a form and it has the wrong information, because that means I have to correct it, either amend it or correct it at some point in time. So you definitely want to search the agent. I always recommend when you're in the MLS, it has the agent's DRE number in California. You can search at dre.ca.gov and pull up the agent's name. It has their address. It has the brokerage they're under, the broker's license number. All that's available to you. And then you bring that into the form properly. And then also check if it's the seller, or if you have both sides, of course, both. But if you're making an offer and somebody else's listing, make sure you check the seller on the seller side, the buyer on the buyer side. Now, this gets input into the in SkySlope or Zip Forms. You can put in the party information and it pulls it in. But you want to make sure you put in the DRE number so it pulls that in as well and pulls it in properly. Once it's in correctly once, it'll be in right the whole way through. So very important to use the party information Zip Forms, or put the contacts in SkySlope, so that information gets pulled through all the way through. Now, you'll see here the potentially competing buyers and sellers. Form PRBS is referenced right there in the document, and the ABA form if there's additional broker agreement as well. So all of this is already covered up front. And now let's get down to, and Form AD. So all these things are referenced on the very first page rather than attaching them up front. I believe these forms can be attached to the back as a reference, but we don't know yet. It hasn't been released, finalized. Let's go through the meat of the form. Now, in the old days, as a listing agent, I would get cover letters. I ignored the cover letters because I didn't want to risk reading the cover letter and seeing the price there and missing it on the actual document, or same with the other terms. What I like about this is you can get an offer and right away scan the key information. There's a purchase price. If it's all cash, you would check there. Close of escrow, days from acceptance, or date. I always prefer days from acceptance, because you can put a date in, say 30 days from today, but if we spend a week negotiating, we've lost 7 days. So always put days from acceptance as my recommendation. Expiration of offer by default, and this is a common mistake. By default, the expiration, the offer expires 3 days from when it's offered. So you don't need to withdraw it unless your buyer wants to pull it back within that time, because at the end of 3 days, the offer is now terminated. Now, if you want a shorter or longer time, you can adjust it here. Initial deposit. Interesting, in every area, it's a little different, I've come to learn. In West LA, almost always 3%. In Inland Empire, $10,000 is like the maximum when you're talking about $100,000, $200,000 houses. That's a big chunk of money, obviously. And even on $800,000 houses, $10,000 is the typical maximum many of the time. But put the percentage of price. So if you're going to make an offer on an $840,000 house, instead of calculating 3% in the old days, $24,000, put in 3%. That way, if the price gets negotiated, the deposit gets negotiated automatically as well. And that's expected within 3 days by wire transfer. Now, I've seen people say, well, instead of wire transfer, we're going to use some other method. You can always get the money there faster. The problem is cashier's check these days and personal checks take longer to clear. So definitely I would use the default when I can within 3 days. I don't accept the check. I don't want a cashier's check. I want the buyer to send the money directly to escrow. Increased deposit, very common on probates. Typically, you put enough money to get into escrow, maybe 3%. And then once the buyer has cleared contingencies, they'll raise it up to 10%. So you have an increased deposit of 7% of the purchase price upon removal of all contingencies. And so you just put 7 here and leave that blank, and that would cover you. But you'd have to check the increased deposit box to make that apply. So increased deposit, 7%, and then leave that for probates that require court confirmation only. Loan amounts, this is a nice change also, because you can put the percentage rather than the dollar amount. I like that because you can calculate it, nothing wrong with that. But if you're doing a 10%, 20% down, 15, 3%, by putting that percentage there, it makes it easier to read. And again, as in the old days, there was verbiage that said as the price changed, so with the percentages, but this made it more clear to the buyer and seller upfront what you're planning to do. Buyer plans to pay X points, if any, you would put that in there. And this gives them the time period they have 17 days from acceptance. If it's FHA or VA, you would check that. If it's seller financing, then you would check that form and attach the appropriate form. So again, more clarity on the loan detail right here than in the prior form. Additional amount financed would be if you have a second loan or other financing, not so common. On E, occupancy type, by default, the offer is primary residence. The person buying it is going to live there. If you're buying it as an investor, and I think also, and I get these all the time, where they're buying a property with a tenant in it and they leave it default as primary occupant. Well, that's not the case. They're buying it with a tenant. It's an investment property almost by definition. So again, you want to make sure you check that box if it's appropriate. Seller credit, again, a nice change here. You put the percentage of the purchase price. Now you can put the dollar amount if it's a fixed amount, nothing wrong with that. But if you're going to make it 2 or 3%, you would put that number there. And then it already has a verbiage, seller credit, to be applied to the closing costs or other. The nice thing is, in the old days, we have to write an addendum that spelled it out, because if it was for other than the closing costs, and really it'd be for the non-recurring closing costs only, if it was other than that, then it might affect the lender terms on the buyer side or the seller side. So you might want to put non-recurring closing costs. If your lender requires that, you should check. Verification of funds. If it's all cash, either you attach with the offer by default or within 3 days. Verification of down payment. You either attach that with your offer or click here to get it within 3 days. And then the verification of loan approval. Application. Either attach the applied or you make sure you commit to do that within 3 days. So again, this is all laid out. Just because you don't check it doesn't mean you're not doing anything. There is default language that you're saying it's attached. So submit an offer without all cash, the deposit money, or the loan down payment money, or loan application would be inappropriate. You really want to make sure you either attach the documents or give yourself 3 days to get that done. Now, this one's interesting. Final verification of property, which is referred as a walkthrough. And you have a Form VP to verify that. 5 days prior to close of escrow. So what happens is you might want to make it tighter than that. You might make it 1 day, 2 days, 3 days before the close of escrow. But here's what happens. If you do a walkthrough and your closing is delayed, you have the right to go back and using this verbiage, you have the right to go back and do it again unless you waived it with a Form VP. So again, pay attention to how these dates work in your transaction. If you're signing it, you have up to 17 days, or if you check different, to resolve the assignment of who you're signing the property to. Loan contingencies, again, default 17 days. Here's the loan no contingency. Appraisal, same thing, 17 days. Now, I believe this used to be 21 and 17, but now we have 17 and 17. You can waive the contingency right here. Investigation period, default 17 days or less. So this is where you would put the shorter time period. And instead of putting in the blank line, waiving contingencies or waiving appraisal, this is the appropriate place to do it. Make sure you put it properly here. What you don't want, and I see this happen, is they leave the default here at 17 days and then write, no loan contingency. Well, but here it says you have one. Now you have two phrases competing with each other. Make sure you get it correct and check the box if that's what you're doing. Again, these are the other time periods. And then if you're waiving all contingencies, you would click here and attach the CR, the contingency removal form. So that would waive these contingencies, but might not waive these contingencies, or might waive those contingencies depending on the particulars of how you fill out the Form CR. If there's a buyer's property, it's right there, you would click it. Possession, time of possession is by default 6 p.m., not 5 p.m., on the date specified, or in 3M2, which is down below, or the attached form. So by default, it is going to be based on when it's vacant at the close of escrow at 6 p.m., unless you have these forms. So you have to think about, do you want it to be possession a day after because your seller needs time to move out, or 2 days to move out? You would put those dates and times in here. Seller occupied a vacant property. Again, you would put down whatever the appropriate time period is. Tenant occupied, you would have the form that you would attach. Documents, these are the time periods for different performance. Seller delivered documents within 7 days. This gets missed a lot, that the seller has 7 days to be in compliance. And sometimes the seller will say, well, the buyer didn't comply with the loan. But if you don't deliver your documents in 7 days, and that means all of them, the seller technically is still maybe not in compliance and really can't force the buyer, because then the buyer has time to review those documents. So this is very important to pay attention to in your transactions. Seller return escrow holder of general provisions within 5 days. Time to pay any fees for HOA, 3 days. Now that's a short clock because you got to find out who the HOA is, and oftentimes pay for that in a credit card. Who's paying for it is important. Something you need to pay attention to if you're the buyer or the seller. Who's paying for those forms, and then get that information to escrow if they're ordering it, or order it however you're going to get it done. Installing smoke detectors 7 days after acceptance, not the day before escrow, but this is supposed to be done early so that the buyer can actually inspect these things when they do their inspection. Now, things included and excluded all laid out here. And then here's the allocation of costs. And fairly straightforward. But a couple of things I'd point out: escrow fees. Who pays escrow? You could click buyer or seller, or each pay their own. Now, each pay their own is different than each pay 50, they say 50-50. For example, as an escrow company I've worked with, that they don't charge the seller, they only charge the buyer. So each their own means the seller pays nothing, the buyer pays an amount, and the buyer might not be happy with that. So you might, if you're on the buyer side, might want to put 50-50. If you're the seller, you might want to put each their own, because that way you can get an escrow for free if the escrow is waiving their fees. Owner's title policy, most commonly paid for by the seller. You would name the company there. And the buyer's lender policy is normally paid by the buyer. In fact, there's not even a checkbox here to change that. County and city taxes are almost always paid by a seller. Maybe the exception is a short sale, but almost always paid by the seller. And you can see here now the pre-printed HOA fee for preparing disclosures, by default, the seller. Not even default. There's no place to override it. HOA certification fee paid for by the buyer. It's not even a place you can override it. Here, you'd have to put that down in other terms, meaning if the seller wanted the buyer to pay the HOA forms, if the buyer's going to pay for it, you have to write it down here. If the seller wanted to, they'd have to counter that. And if the buyer, they're going to pay the certification form, if they expect the seller to, they should put it down below. Now, most commonly, the seller pays the disclosures because those are forms the seller's been given, probably lost, or has access to. And the seller has determined who the HOA is, they're a member of it, and they can determine their own fees. So theoretically, the seller has decided those fees. Why should they not pay them? The certification fee is usually paid for because extra work required by the lender, and that's why typically it's paid for by the buyer. So those are by far the most common transactions. And then you'll see we have property addenda. The one I'm involved with a lot is probate purchase agreement. So in the old days, we had a probate purchase agreement, and then we had this probate purchase agreement addendum that we use for other properties like vacant land. Well, now we're going to use this form for the purchase and attach the probate purchase agreement, which now you need to go back and double check and learn how these forms work. Same with manufactured homes. A tenant occupied property addendum form would be if there is a tenant who's going to stay there. And the tenants in common purchase addendum is another addendum that you would use to the standard purchase agreement. So now instead of using customized purchase agreements for each of these types, we have a standard purchase agreement, and then we have these addendums that we apply as well. Other addendum, this is where you would put, if you have another term and it's too long to write in the other terms, you would just attach addendum 1, and put the form there. You don't need to worry about fitting every word in. And then these addendums are also appropriate. Now, I see buyers who write, it's a backup offer, or issues about the septic tank, or it was a short sale. All these addendums are pre-written so that you have the opportunity to just click them and put the forms in where it's necessary. So that's by far the most common things. And I would say that you want to get all the common verbiage that you can. In general, you want to use as few words as you have to. And you notice the rest is almost all is already filled in. And the one thing you want to make sure you do is you have your buyer check the boxes for mediation and arbitration. 1, 2, as well as 3. So there's 3 spots on that document that they have to sign. And if you're the seller and you get this offer, you make sure they come back and sign these things, or initial these things as well, so you don't miss those. And then just a little different format for acceptance at the end. There's entity buyers. And this was good because sometimes I actually have an escrow right now where I have 2 sellers. One's a person, one's an entity. So this kind of accommodates that on the buyer side. And then the seller side, this gives you a little more room for putting the information. But here's interesting. Buyer acknowledges receipt of and read every page and all attachments that make up the agreement. I like that phrase. It's important. Sometimes companies want to say, well, you didn't have the seller initial every page. Okay, but it's attached. It's a PDF. And he already reviewed On the seller side, it says the same thing right here. The seller acknowledges all the pages. And so it's already been covered in the process. A little more room for the RCSD form, which is representative capacity signature disclosure form, and more room to write out what it's going to be. And it has a type and the case number if it's a trust or a probate. Gives you more room to fill less form out and more information on the actual page. Then you have the broker section. If there's more than one broker, so it gives us more opportunities to work together and share. And then lastly is the escrow information. So again, here's what I would say. When you present an offer, this is a sales presentation. You want these, especially first couple pages, to look perfect. If there's any question about what you put on here, think about it, review it, talk to your broker. If you're my team, call me, and let's make sure we make it right. Anything else you think you need to write, you should talk to somebody who's experienced, whether it be your broker. If you're on my team, talk to me, because I believe the forms fill 99.9% of the terms you might put on a contract. If you think you have the 0.01% change, then let's talk about it rather than overlook the standard verbiage, which by and far is going to give you the best outcome most of the time. So that's my overview. I'm Bill Gross. I'm a real estate broker here in Los Angeles, California for eXp Realty. And whether you're on my team or not, I'm here to help. Reach out, call, text, email me if I can help you. Make today your best day ever. Thanks so much.